Let's talk about Canada for just a second. Everybody's talking about Canada these days, or at least Canadians feel like everybody is talking about Canada these days. I don't know if that's true. And then I'll sum things up. Recent cover in The Economist. Liberty moves north. Canada's example to the world. Boy, did we like that one. But the truth is, it's not quite like this. This, of course, gives a suggestion that it might be. Isn't he beautiful? Our new Prime Minister in Canada. He's been in power for a year now, Justin Trudeau. The king of the selfie. Canadians, actually, his personal popularity numbers remain quite high, but the government approval numbers are coming down now. We're getting over our sugar high with Justin Trudeau. Things are changing a little bit. It's becoming more competitive now. But certainly this was a visual representation of something different in the world in comparison to some of the things that we've just discussed, my other panelists have just discussed. But here's the truth about this idea of a Canadian exception. Canada is exceptional because some of the things that you're talking about that are driving populism in other places aren't being experienced in Canada. And there's a reason for that. Canadians value compromise and tolerance. If there's anything that is kind of like a national set of values, it's that. Compromise and tolerance, live and let live. It's how a weak, young nation that's had to put together two major different cultures, the French and the English cultures, have been able to keep the country together. The country's only 150 years old. We're celebrating our 150th anniversary this year. It's that compromise and tolerance that makes it all possible. These values have evolved over time. They were very much the same situation under Stephen Harper, Jean Chrétien, all the previous prime ministers. They all added to this process. It was not something unique to this current government or this current leader, although they've done a great job of continuing to enhance it. These values were not central to the outcome of the last election. It wasn't like there was this populist Trumpian type option versus Justin Trudeau. That was not what the election was fought over. So it really wasn't a populist type of an election in Canada last time. I like to call what happened in 2008 the great economic disruption. It was something different than just a recession or an economic correction. It was really a disruption in terms of the world's economic course. It pretty much missed Canada. Our banks didn't melt down. There was no real estate crisis. Thousands and thousands of people were not thrown out of work. The inequality issue as a result of what started with 2008 simply did not embed in Canada. It's not really a big driving issue of how people think about what's going on in their country today. And it's a big part of what I think some of my colleagues have been talking about. Canada brings in more immigrants per capita than any other major country in the world, tied to a certain extent with Australia, depending on how you look at it. But these immigrants, it's not a humanitarian effort. They're mostly economic. Only about 20% of our immigrants are actually refugees. And it's been that way for many, 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 many years. Essentially, the Canadian immigration policy is not about putting up walls. It's actually about recruiting people to come and participate in our economy. So the types of things that are happening in other countries where people are upset about immigration or fearing immigration, we're getting different kinds of immigrants in Canada because we're bringing them in from other parts of the country, or other parts of the world, mostly Asia. In fact, the number of Syrian immigrants we brought in last year was only about 45,000. We brought in 330,000 total immigrants, about 1% of our population. So it's nothing new. All drivers of disruption are more muted in Canada. People are not seeking radical political solutions. It looks like it's a bit of an exception, but that's because the circumstances in the country are different from many of the other places that we're talking about. However, a confluence of events plus poor management could create a Canadian version of what's happening elsewhere, and we've seen these kinds of tones coming out in leadership contests, political discussions that have been happening in the country of late. We had a terrorist incident in the last couple of days that's also generated a certain amount of dialogue around some of these questions. But whatever it is, it won't be exactly like it is everywhere else. It'll be a Canadian version because of the circumstances that exist within the country. So is there a Canadian exception? Yes, I would argue that there is a Canadian exception, but it's not because we're all a bunch of Teletubbies. It's because the circumstances in the country are different. So, one of my favorite songs, Buffalo Springfield, for what it's worth, for all you old guys, you know what I'm talking about. 1967, the time of the Kent State shootings. And I think they put it, Neil Young actually wrote this, a Canadian, and I think he put it really succinctly and very well. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. We want to call it populism, but I really have to ask the question if it really is populism. Because a lot of what we're talking about here is not that popular. I think Ben did a good job of demonstrating some of that in the UK, some of these populist sentiments. What is happening, though, is what Cliff described in terms of how all these things come together. In the right political circumstances, with the right political system, can have an effect, can have a decisive effect. But it's the combination of those two things. It's the opinions plus the circumstances. And usually what we're talking about here is a disruptive political minority, not a majority. We saw that in the United States. For example, in Holland, we're looking at another circumstance like that, in which a very small portion of the vote is probably potentially going to elect a fairly radical right-wing government, but they're probably going to get 20%, only about 20% of the vote. It's a proportional representation system, very strange party structures. It's that decisive group in that political circumstance that can lead to that outcome. Is that populist? I would kind of argue that we're dealing with something else here. What does it all add up to? I think we need a new term. I don't know what it is. Be interested in your comments on what that might be, the discussion with the panelists. Gaby's thoughts on that too. She's a wordsmith. What is the term? Because I don't think it is populism. I think it's a lazy term. It combines nativism, the system is broken, a rejection of authority and expertise, an end of progress, leading to disruptive elections and unexpected political outcomes. But they're not necessarily popular. Given the universality of forces, we're setting up, as Cliff has quite correctly stated, for an ongoing period of political uncertainty and instability. So in that kind of a context, I think we have to work hard on getting our terms right. And I don't think populist is the way to describe it. I submit for your consideration. Some big tests are coming up. March, the Netherlands. Henri was pointing out in France, we've got a potentially disruptive election about to occur. Robert Grimm is here, our German colleague. He's dealing with this in Germany right now. Just by December, we could have South Korea, 2018 or earlier. Nando could be into another election where he's dealing with the situation in Italy. So we've got some big challenges to all of this coming up. And certainly Ipsos is going to be taking a look at what's going on in terms of public opinion. But I'd like to remind everybody of one of my favorite quotes. It's from Leo Tolstoy from Anna Karenina. And this is, I think, the overall message of this. All happy families are basically happy in the same way, but unhappy families, and that's what we're talking about here in many of these countries, are unhappy in their own way. And it's the job of the researcher, the people who are sitting at this table, other people here who are in the audience who do research, to understand the nuance of what's happening in each of these individual countries. Thank you very much.